Excuse me. Thank you very much.
All right, so I'm just going to read your biography, a few minutes,
Sure.
and then we can get started. Thank you. Dr. Debbie Lee is an experienced renewable energy and climate change specialist with a demonstrated history of working at the grassroots, local and regional scales, and in different sectors in the areas of clean energy and climate energy mitigation and adaptation. She has a very strong entrepreneurship and social and natural sciences profession, and also professional degrees in geography and environment, civil, mechanical, and electrical engineering. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Lee. Dr. Lee, the floor is yours. You can share your screen. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, and good morning. Hope you're all doing well. Thank you very much for this kind invitation. I had sent my slides previously, asking if you could share on your end. Okay, so I hope you can see it this time around.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Well, hello again, and hope you're all doing well. I really enjoyed the previous presentations. So I'm going to talk today about how to bring mitigation and adaptation together within the energy systems. And I'm going to show a little bit of the work that we did in the IPCC and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change throughout the sixth assessment report. So just as a little, excuse me, background, back when we developed the special report on global warming at 1.5 degrees C, part of our mandate from the countries was to do a joint assessment of mitigation and adaptation response options. And the problem with doing that, the challenge was that mitigation and adaptation are usually assessed as two different and independent blocks. Mitigation usually follows different economic sectors, while adaptation follows risk areas. So representative key risks.
No.
So,
hello?
Okay, so what we did in the IPCC was to work within 5 system transitions that helped us bring together mitigation and adaptation options to do a joint assessment, but also helped us to look at the interlinkages between different adaptation options and between different mitigation options. So that effectively helped to do an analysis and assessment of synergies and trade-offs between mitigation, between adaptation, between each other, and then also with the Sustainable Development Goals. So then we have land, ocean, and ecosystem system transitions, urban, rural, and infrastructure, energy, industry, and societal. And within that work of system transitions, we carried out a multi-dimensional feasibility assessment. And this was important because it took us out of the established norm of looking only at the economic and technological dimensions. Because really, whether we work in government or as practitioners, we always look at, are the economic and financial conditions present? For example, what are the rates of return or the cost benefit analysis? And in terms of technology, is a technology there? Is a technology robust? What is the technological capacity? So we also looked in terms of the sustainability and effectiveness of both mitigation and adaptation options. We looked at different dimensions, including social, cultural, institutional, environmental, and ecological, and then geophysical. So this table just shows an example of the different indicators that were used for both mitigation and adaptation. In some of the cases, they're pretty similar, like under social cultural dimensions, but in others, like in economic and technological, we have quite different indicators. But what we wanted to grasp here is, in order for something to work, to be effective, to deliver the result that we want in the long term, we needed to look at issues such as political acceptability. Do we have the legal and regulatory framework, for example, for greater solar energy uptake, or institutional capacity, transparency and accountability? And in terms of social cultural, for example, looking at social cultural, at social co-benefits, which mainly links to the Sustainable Development Goals, social cultural acceptability, social and regional inclusiveness, intergenerational equity, and gender equity. And one thing that we try to be flexible in is in recognizing that a lot of these options, especially for adaptation, including for energy options that also reduce vulnerability to climate impacts, that context is very important, and that not all of these indicators might fit or be applicable to all contexts. So then there is also this flexibility of if one of these indicators are not useful, that you could insert your own. So for example, if I was working in Central America in a rural community under sociocultural, I might add something on indigenous knowledge or Mayan cosmovision. Because IPCC does global assessments, and this assessment was done at a global level, the indicators that are shown here are ones for which we found sufficient literature to carry out an assessment, but also that had an equal representation across regions. But again, these indicators are ones that can be changed according to the specific needs of where it's going to be applied. So within each one of these indicators, we came up with some guiding questions that help both researchers and practitioners see what type of information we need to gather. And this exercise is not meant to add significant work, but just to look, again, beyond the technical and the economic, but also that while we're looking at, for example, social co-benefits or different acceptability issues, we can start identifying some of the synergies and trade-offs that might come with other options. So here, for example, we're looking at some of the institutional indicators on acceptability and what are the specific issues that we might want to look at. The same for social cultural, for example, the inclusion of different social groups. How are remote regions better included? What happens when there's public resistance, for example? And then here's some examples for mitigation under technical dimensions, discussing, for example, scalability. What are the technological risks, and how simple is it to operate, maintain, and adapt to local conditions? And again, the response to each of these will depend upon specific local conditions. So what we did at the end was assess for high, medium, and low feasibility. And of course, there are some contexts or for some regions where there isn't sufficient evidence, but that clearly indicates where the research gaps, where we need to do more work. And hopefully for IPCC 7th assessment report, these knowledge gaps will be better to, we'll be able to cover them both regionally and globally. And then, of course, for each one of these, we had an extensive line of sight as to why we are assessing this way. So when looking at this exercise and how useful it is, for example, to assess not just for energy systems, but how useful this tool can be, we assessed it towards that because it's an IPCC assessment, there is a bias towards peer-reviewed literature, but in reality, you could just use other types of information or data gathering tools such as questionnaires or looking at great literature. That this tool actually covers multiple system transitions. So then there aren't, it really doesn't use the top-down accounts, and most of the questions are actually targeted at getting information on the ground with beneficiaries of projects. There is a clear line of sight, so there aren't any issues with transparency. And I think one of the bigger benefits is that we don't look at single options, but just as the interactions between different options. So for example, if we're looking at the interaction of energy, food, water, it's this type of assessment and looking at at system transitions actually helps look at those co-benefits and trade-offs that otherwise might not be addressed simply because we are not looking for them, and which is the case of why we, in many cases, we get maladaptation. Gaps are clearly identified, and again, hopefully there will be, this indicates to different countries and governments where focus is needed and where more finance is needed for research. And here, because we're targeting specific indicators within dimensions, we can give a clear signal to policymakers on what the priorities are in terms of where the bigger gaps are. So here is a list of all the different adaptation options we look throughout the different systems. And if we can see, there are 3 options that we assess for energy as a means for adaptation, which are improving water use efficiency, resilient power systems, and energy reliability. But if you can see the list of options of the other system transitions, you can also see where energy is also needed. So despite energy having its own block, we can also start seeing the different benefits or co-benefits, for example, within urban and rural infrastructure, different options of water use, or when we talk about health systems and disaster risk management, climate services, early warning systems. So this was one of the main figures of the summary for policymakers, and in the 6 columns to the right, we can see in light blue and turquoise the feasibility of the options per dimension. The bigger the circle, the higher the feasibility. And something to keep in mind is that when we talk about low feasibility, it doesn't necessarily mean that the option is bad or we should stay away from it. It means that there is probably one indicator or a couple indicators or a dimension that have significant barriers. So again, that helps us target where actions are needed. So, and then in the columns on the to the left, the darker colored circles, we have the composite feasibility, and then we have synergies with mitigation. So if we look at options such as forest-based adaptation or resilient power systems, we see that these options score high in feasibility, but also have strong synergies with mitigation. And the color of the circles, at least for composite feasibility and synergies with mitigation, represent how confident we are with the results. So taking a closer look, for example, at land and ocean ecosystems, we can see that forest-based adaptation, biodiversity management, and improved cropland management have higher feasibility and stronger synergies. The same with urban infrastructure and systems. We have green infrastructure and ecosystem services, but also with urban planning and sustainable urban water management, we have between medium and high feasibility. And here again, we can see, the co-benefits with energy systems and how energy systems are needed also for these other, like for urban and for agriculture. So taking a closer look at the feasibility of energy systems, we can see that the main barrier is in the institutional aspect, and it's mainly due to policies and regulations, and in some cases, transparency mechanisms. So this means that there are countries, for example, in Latin America, where a lack of incentives towards renewable energy technologies poses a barrier, or that you have, for example, a regulatory system that is not fully implemented. Or, for example, when you look at in Central America, when we're trying to have a greater use of efficient cook stoves, the problem we face is who is the main institution to work with? Is it the health ministries, or it could be energy or environment or forestry? Technically, it should be all of them together, but there are elements that belong to everybody. And in most governments, all of these ministries work in a very siloed way that impede a closer collaboration between them. But what we can see here is one of the I think successes for the energy sector within IPCC's Working Group 2 on Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability was a recognition of energy as a means for adaptation, because energy has traditionally been seen as mitigation options. You have big energy systems that help reduce emissions, which they clearly do. And also at the smaller scale, we look at energy for example, poverty alleviation, which it also does. But energy options, especially renewable energies, clean energy technologies, are in a unique position to simultaneously meet the triple objective of sustainable development and poverty alleviation, climate change mitigation, and climate change adaptation. And here we can see that, where we have either higher, medium, composite feasibility, and we have mostly strong synergies with mitigation. So overall, I think, especially when we're looking, for example, at standalone systems and rural applications, we see a mostly high feasibility, especially in social cultural. But of course, there are cases like with Mayan communities in Guatemala, where the approach matters and how you talk with communities and how you link your projects to Mayan cosmovision. So it's not that you're changing the scope of the project, you're just presenting it in a way of, for example, how you are being respectful to Mother Nature. But it also shows the weaknesses that we have institutionally. And even though I'm exemplifying Central America, which is the area where I mostly work in, if we look at this figure, institutional is mostly at a low or medium feasibility throughout most of the options. So this means that institutional aspects are a problem worldwide. We see probably half of the options have low institutional feasibility that ranges from issues of acceptability to transparency to robust institutions. So just like with all the other options, this is also a problem for the energy sector. But again, the recognition that energy can serve both mitigation and adaptation, and that there is this strong linkage, I think is very important, because in practice it helps us bring together these two areas of mitigation and adaptation, and it can help, for example, avoid different injustices that can happen when you do, for example, big projects on indigenous lands. And it can also help avoid, for example, maladaptation that we have also seen. Lastly, we also have several cross-sectoral options that also require energy. For example, health and health systems, disaster risk management and climate services, and early warning systems. So again, just to reemphasize that part of this exercise was not just to look at energy systems in and of themselves, but also how they link to broader mitigation and adaptation options. Here we can see the linkage of each one of these options to each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, with the caveat here that the spaces that are blank mean that we didn't have enough literature to carry out the assessment. So that doesn't mean there isn't a linkage, just that we didn't have enough evidence to say whether there was a strong linkage or not. But here to see it a bit more clear is that all of the options assessed, including energy, had a positive linkage with the SDG 3 on health and well-being, SDG 6 on clean water and sanitation, and SDG 11 on sustainable cities and communities, again highlighting how the systemic approach can have an overall benefit. And when we look at mitigation options, we can see more or less the same trend. For example, looking at urban, green, and blue infrastructure serving as both mitigation and adaptation, and that although there are different energy options that reduce emissions and that can have competition with land, there is a lot multiple evidence that policies can indeed help shape how these trade-offs are managed, and to minimize the trade-offs and to maximize the co-benefits. Again, highlighting the important role that institutions and policies and regulations have in increasing the effectiveness of different options. So what this brings us to is that in bringing together mitigation and adaptation, we're also looking at the interdependence with ecosystems and an enhanced biodiversity, meeting the Sustainable Development Goals that leads us to a climate resilient development, of which energy systems are also a part of. So while we have this aspirational goal of the Paris Agreement of having global warming levels limited to below 1.5 degrees C, we also have a business as usual pathway when we're not meeting our climate targets and we are in a deeply carbonized economy, leading us to temperatures of above, well, close to 3 degrees C. But we also have a number of pathways in the middle. And even that being on a business as usual pathway now doesn't lock us in, and that we still have a decade to take action, not just to achieve the SDGs, but to change this pathway. Because if you look at the dotted lines on the upper pathway, these dotted lines indicate pathways that are lost to us due to decisions and actions made in the past. And that if we lose this window of action, this window of opportunity, the next upper green line that takes us to 1.5 degrees C will also be lost, because we have reached different limits, and in that different adaptation and mitigation options won't be useful. So, for example, in Central America, one big problem we have is with El Nino, and that all of the countries are highly dependent, are primary fossil fuel importers, but we also, as a region, generate almost 70% renewable energy generation. Most of this is hydroelectric. But with worsening El Nino periods, different countries like Costa Rica and Panama have decreased their hydroelectric generation and are now relying on fossil fuel imports. So while globally it is good to increase renewable energy generation, the examples that we have in Central America highlight the vulnerability of having this strong dependence to renewable energy without having any other backup. So what El Nino means is that in the region, fossil fuel consumption is going up. So that means we have to rely more on geothermal, on wind and solar, and of course on storage that the region currently doesn't have. And even though we have a regional grid that spans from Guatemala all the way to Panama, and that countries are able to inject more renewable energy generation to help countries make for any losses like the ones currently suffered, there isn't sufficient renewable energy generation currently to meet the deficit that El Nino is causing because of the drought. So when we're looking at how to move in these pathways, these are some of the considerations that need to be taken. What are the limits to hydroelectric generation in the region or worldwide for other countries that have a high hydroelectric dependence, and how much more, for example, solar or wind we can put in, and how much energy storage we're going to need, so the intermittency issues aren't that big. So following on with climate resilient development, what it also calls for, and which links back to the feasibility assessment, and then how you try to engage, for example, equity and inclusions, is that societal choices are very important, and that we need to engage all of society in different arenas of engagement or spaces in which everybody, each and every one of us, whether as academics, professors, researchers, practitioners, can interact and can have a voice. And some of these arenas include economic and financial, knowledge and technology, ecological, political, social, cultural, and community, so that we enable higher climate resilient development that includes knowledge diversity. For example, how we include indigenous knowledge like Mayan cosmovision, ecosystem stewardship, equity, ethics, justice, and inclusion. So here, bringing together the different parts of the figure I showed is how different participation from everybody can shape the pathways to different futures. So what I try to highlight here is that we can bring mitigation and adaptation together. We still have a lot of work to do for that to be effective, but that energy is one that inherently already brings it together, even though, for example, at least on the adaptation side, it hasn't always been capitalized. But there are many examples in which energy has already helped reduce the vulnerability to climate impacts, especially to rural populations and to people with higher vulnerability or that are marginalized. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Debbie, for that wonderful, insightful presentation. I have one question for you. A lot of countries, especially developing countries that have limited resources, how can they be supported in their transition to clean energy solutions?
So if I may, I'll give the example of Central America, that we still have somewhat of a gap for energy access. And that part of energy access, we're trying to cover it mainly with renewable energy, isolated system, or distributed generation. There's a lot of renewable energy potential, especially through small scale community hydroelectrics. And the model that we're trying to follow is through cooperative that are linked with productive use applications. There's a lot, for example, of coffee and cardamom and I guess historically, like in, I guess, many other developing countries, the products are, you pick the coffee and then you export it for it to be processed, and then you import it back as like the coffee that you drink at higher cost. So what we're trying to do is link these, like domestic uses such as illumination with different productive use applications. There is, in Guatemala, the new government has a strong push to close this gap by 2030. And when was it? At the end of 2018, the presidents of Central America jointly committed to be the first region of the world to achieve universal access to electricity services by 2030. So while there has been some activity, there still needs more. But most of this energy poverty and energy access gap will be with renewable energy. The region is right now, as I mentioned, at 70% renewable energy generation. There is still a push to have more renewable energy generation, but not so much dependent on hydroelectricity because of El Nino and because of all the droughts that we're currently seeing. So I think biomass and geothermal energy are the ones that have a lot of potential. Wind and solar energy are already seeing a lot of growth. But what is needed is to have greater incentives for this to happen. I mean, there are different financing mechanisms like multilateral development banks, but there is always this question of the countries of what are like the loan rates that you get, or any preferential rates, and that, how feasible is it for developing countries that also have other developmental needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have one last question for you.
Sure.
So what do different sectors need to do, like especially in the agricultural sector? What do they need to do in order to, I know you talked about a little bit of that, but like, can you just expand more on what different sectors, like especially agriculture, need to do to adapt to utilize clean energy effectively?
Thank you. Great question. I think first of all is to look at those linkages between agriculture and energy, and that when I talked about governments usually taking this siloed approach, is how you get ministries mainly to talk together, because it's not about the technologies. The technologies are there. It's getting the institutions to realize the value of doing it. And as the feasibility assessment showed, the institutional part is usually the weakest. What we've been trying to highlight is the interlinkages that there are, and that even though we talk about, of course, we promote renewable energy and clean energy, we also need to realize that clean energy can bring trade-offs and can bring injustices, such as, I'm going to expand a little bit on that, is like when we talk about electromobility, or just all the storage that is needed in the critical minerals and lithium extraction. And the big harm lithium extraction is doing in some countries, that, for example, in South America, you have the salt marshes, and that there are indigenous communities that that are highly dependent on agriculture, and that the extraction of lithium is contaminating water that is used for human consumption and for agriculture. So what are the different energy activities that are harming agricultural activities, but also what are the opportunities that agricultural activities have in using renewable energy for their processing. And there are many examples, again, at a smaller scale of like coffee co-ops, cooperatives that already use like either solar drying or small scale hydros for their different processing. So it's how you bring them together. But I think at the end is when you look at a system transitions approach, it really helps you look at the interactions that there are. Like, even if I say, in one single project, I'll use solar and hydro, what are the implications of one over the other? And if me using a hydroelectric, even if it's run of the river, will I have any impact downstream, depending on the capacity and so forth. So I think it's really keeping it in mind, because many times I think we go in and thinking, oh, of course, renewable energy is good. It reduces emissions. And we just go with that mindset of it is good, even though it can have negative implications. That does not mean we don't use renewable energy. It's more of the implementation, like, are we using indigenous land without talking to indigenous peoples and respecting their cultures and traditions? It could be something as simple as that, or something more complex of, I'm really diverting water from something else, and maybe I need to have a broader dialogue.
Thank you. I think that was the last thing you said was very profound, which is we need to think about how can we integrate indigenous people. So it's kind of like solving problems with local solutions as opposed to looking at what developed societies are doing and how do we solve our problems locally. And it could just be simple as that, because some technologies, for instance, I remember there was something about using drones for, this is not necessarily in energy, but in agriculture, using drones to supply water and other things for, or maybe like fertilizers, something like that. But in any case, some of these developed countries don't even have access to 24 hours electricity. So when you start deploying very, very high-tech technology, sometimes it doesn't work. It's just sometimes they just need something very simple. So thank you so much for your wonderful insight, Dr. Lee. I really appreciate you being here today and taking time out to speak with us. Thank you very much. We're going to thank you so much for attending the conference. We have upcoming conferences at the Green Institute. We have the World Environment Day that comes up in June 5th, 2024. It's a virtual conference online. The theme for this conference is the land restoration, desertification, and drought resilience. And we're accepting abstracts until 30th of April. Please feel free to present. And we're looking forward to getting more and learning about your research. We also have another conference coming up, World Sustainability Conference. It's a virtual conference, and it's going to hold November 2024. And then we have the Global STEAM Conference that will hold September 5th, 2024. And the theme is building bridges to a sustainable future. So if you can please submit your abstracts, they're online. So we'd really love to hear from you and what you're currently researching. Thank you very much, Dr. Eteris, for sharing this conference. Thank you to Lynn, Evelyn. Thank you everyone for being here today and taking time out of your very busy schedule. We do hope to host this conference again, this time next year. Next year and in April. Again, this is the first edition. And then we hope that by next edition, we would make sure that everything is better and more robust. And also, if you're interested, as a follow-up to this conference, we're going to be doing a collaborative paper with the speakers. And if there's anybody that is also interested, please feel free to send us an email to the Green Institute to show you're interested in the collaborative article. The article is going to be on the theme of the conference. So thank you very much. Until next time, till next year. Thank you, and see you soon.
Adenika,
Bye, everyone.
yeah, Adenika, just a last word. May I just the last note? Hello. Hello,
Yeah, I think
Erika.
people already,
Okay, Erika, Adenike, I want to mention to the participants that I'm going to write a small article on the outcome of the conference, and you can see it in the publication of our institute, okay? In Denmark. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.